Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is the Democratic Party in the mother of all wars with itself? Let's get to the bottom line. So after months of debates about health care, about whether a woman can be president, about billionaires, and about America's legacy of racism and social division, about Russia and its election meddling, or about China now and the coronavirus, the Democratic Party is finally getting closer to picking a candidate who will face off against Republican President Donald Trump in November. The process has been a battle for the soul of the party. Wait, not really just the soul, but the deep soul, which now seems split between the establishment, represented by former Vice President Joe Biden, and the revolution, championed by Senator Bernie Sanders. So which way will this all go, and which candidate has a better chance of inspiring Americans, and more crucially, getting them to the voting polls and leading his party to victory? I emphasize his, as a bunch of hers have already been knocked out of the race. Fortunately, we have three people in the room who have the answers. Reverend Leah Daughtry, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Democratic National Convention, not once, but twice, in 2008 and 2016, and both were historic for the party. Michelle Gale, a grassroots Democratic Party activist in Chicago, she's been canvassing for Bernie Sanders nonstop since his first run in 2016. And Lene Erickson is the Senior Vice President for Social Policy and Politics at Third Way, a progressive think tank here in Washington, D.C. Great to have all of you with us here today to talk about what's all going to unfold in the next couple months. But I want to start with a clip from President Trump, who sort of sets this up nicely.
Who the hell is easier to beat, right? So, who is easier for us, not me, for us to beat? Ready? Crazy Bernie? Or Sleepy Joe? I don't know. I think maybe Crazy Bernie has it a little bit.
Leah, let me pose President Trump's question to you. Has this come to be a race between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, essentially? Are those the two choices we have?
Well, they certainly are at the front of the pack. I don't want to leave out or dismiss Senator Warren, who may have a third way path through here, come through as the uniter between the two factions. But, you know, I think that it's a challenge, and while the Republican Party has certainly been at the forefront of having its own battles, and the Democratic Party is at an inflection point, too, around the direction, the tone, the tenor that our party wants to take in terms of the issues and the direction that it wants to go. So
now, Elizabeth Warren's folks have said that they don't even really see a path there. And so I'm interested in this question, where this is the time of women, Me Too, gender equality, pay equity. It's a time where race is more involved in the politics of this country than ever. How is it, Leah, you've run these a couple of times, that when there has not been a time with this much animation around these issues, that you've got two 78-year-old white men carrying the flags on race and gender?
You know, it's a real challenge, I think, and it's a mystery to me. I think we cannot dismiss the impact of sexism and misogyny in this race and the coverage that Senator Warren has received as opposed to some of the men that have been in the race. But I also think that the system itself is set up to benefit those who understand it. And Senator Sanders, by virtue of his 2016 run, and of course Vice President Biden, have the experience of understanding how campaigns run and unfold, and that's just something that the others who were newcomers to the presidential primary process just didn't have that kind of experience, and so they, you know, made some missteps and some faults that others with more experience did not.
Now, Michelle, I know that you've been a Bernie fan. How do you feel about Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer dropping out, and each of them endorsing Joe Biden?
I think it's very interesting timing. You have to look at, I mean, none of them seemed all too keen on dropping out, and once they did, they immediately went and supported Biden. So I think it raises the question of, would they have dropped out had they not been encouraged? Were they encouraged? I know there's been a lot of talk on that on MSNBC and CNN. But it's also an interesting question because it seems to have turned from being a what's best for the party, what's best for the country, into a Stop Sanders campaign. And I just find that a little bit disheartening because we're in a very, very, very serious election year.
Now, your candidate describes himself as a democratic socialist. Mm-hmm. Are you a democratic socialist or are you a Democrat?
Oh, I'm a Democrat, and I'm a democratic socialist.
You're both.
Yes,
so,
of course.
But it raises an interesting question about how Democrats see themselves and the party. And Bernie Sanders has been an independent in Congress, has identified him in ways that are distinct from the Democratic Party. How deep is the divide between, let me just call it Bernie land and Biden land?
Bernie land and Biden land.
And with all due respect to Warren land.
And Warren land. I think it's
getting smaller and smaller, Warren land.
I think it's very interesting that we have to remember that we're in the United States. And in the United States, we have two political parties to cover an entirely, a massive country full of people with lots of different opinions. And so trying to box everyone who doesn't find themselves on the right into the Democratic Party and saying that they must all think this way or else they're somehow outliers, that's a dangerous assumption. I think that's what risks this election and what cost us the 2016 election.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that in any other nation in the world, she and Joe Biden would be in different parties.
Yep.
But in this country, they're in the same party.
Yeah.
Is that healthy?
Well, I think it's unhealthy that we have a two-party system. It's completely irrational. I mean, every other developed country in the world has a multi-party system.
Lene, let me ask you the same question.
More than
Sorry,
two
Leah?
parties. There's the Green Party. There's
people. Well, but
how does it become viable?
Well, we would
because
have to
we have to make it viable.
We'd have to have a different system.
Well, you have to make it viable. People have to vote for them. In New York, we have the Working Families Party, which has become viable through the time and the energy that people have invested in building that party. So you don't just
and
pop
who's
up
the Working
with a party.
Families Party nominee?
They either in state legislative races they either pick their own,
right,
or they may pick a Republican, or they may pick a Democrat, but on the ballots there is a line called the Working Families Party, and you can choose to vote for their candidate.
Lene, can you help us here?
Well, I think we could all be helped if we did something like ranked choice voting, right? Because I think we can all agree that, especially.
So give us a short form but clear explanation of ranked choice voting.
Means you say, this person's my first choice, this person's my second choice, this person's my third choice.
Doesn't that sound like the Iowa caucus?
No, it's actually more like an instant runoff because it's not a room full of only the same people who can be there for 4 hours and not have a secret ballot. It is a secret ballot, but it's essentially an instant runoff. And I think it's the reason why we and many others are very interested in reforming the electoral process, because when you have so many candidates on the ballot and you have just an up or down vote on those candidates, you get very skewy results. And I think that's some of what we've seen. It's some of why Bernie Sanders has a very vocal but minority within the party set of supporters, and yet he has been getting a plurality of the support because his folks are for him and him first and for him every time, and they'll show up. And there's a lot of other folks who say, oh, I might like Pete, I might like Amy, I might like Kamala, I might like 7 other people who already dropped out, but I'm willing to go in multiple directions. But they don't have the same level of strength in a multi-candidate field as somebody whose supporters are just there and dedicated every single day. But it means that you get outcomes where the person who is the front runner doesn't necessarily represent the majority view of the electorate of that
Lene,
party.
let me ask you the same question I asked Leah about. I mean, I know you talk to the Democratic establishment here in Washington, D.C., good pals, cocktail parties, all of that. Does it bother them that their carrier in Joe Biden right now is one where Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, other minorities, LGBT community, et cetera, lots of them, not all of them, and I want to come back to Michelle here in a moment, but many, and millennials, some of them are out there, although lots of them were with Bernie. But I just am interested in the fact that they're choosing an older white man as their flag carrier in this race, and is that not disheartening after what we've seen with Me Too and Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at the options before us, we have to choose from the hand that we're dealt, right? And I have liked and donated to a lot of people that aren't in the race anymore. I wish they were still there, but they were not actually able to get the support, whether that was money or voters that they needed to stay in the race. So our options are what we have on the table, and I think everyone within the Democratic Party wants to beat Donald Trump. So the fundamental question is, who can do that? And I think there's 2 theories. One is, in order to beat Donald Trump, you have to turn out voters that have never come to the polls before. You have to energize people. You have to really get the base of the party out, and that's how we're going to win the Electoral College. And the other theory is we have to appeal to folks that are already going to be going to the polls and, in fact, voted for Democrats in the midterms but didn't in 2016, those swing voters, as well as also energizing the party. And I think that's the debate that we're having right now, is which of those work. I love Joe Biden. I have worked with him on guns for a very long time. I have not picked a candidate in this race. I also think Elizabeth Warren is phenomenal and has a plan for everything. I think that
she does have a plan for everything.
There were many other folks that, as I said, I've been really excited about as an LGBT American. I was super excited about Pete.
I do want to play a clip from Joe Biden commenting about why he's running.
Talk is cheap. False promises are deceptive. And talk about revolution and changing anyone's life. We need real changes right now. Something I've done my whole career, and I'll do as president. So this is an election to spend all our time in a battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. This is a battle for the soul of the United States of America.
So I want to ask all of you, are those comments from Joe Biden about running for president, or are they about capturing the Democratic Party and stopping Bernie Sanders? Michelle?
I mean, he's clearly gung-ho on stopping Sanders. But I think what's very, very important is that we're looking at a candidate who's, as has been said, a milquetoast candidate running up against a gangster. This is not going to work. Biden is not going to beat Trump.
So Biden is the milquetoast candidate?
Biden cannot beat Trump. I mean, he's such a sweetie, and you hear him
Biden
talk. I watched for an hour and a half last night.
But what about the polls? I mean, one of the interesting things are out there,
Trump.
and of course, I have something I want to play from Bernie Sanders. Let's just go ahead and play it. Play the Bernie Sanders clip.
And I say to all of those pundits and establishment folks who think we can't beat Trump, take a look at the last 70 national polls. We beat Trump 65 out of those 70.
I found Bernie's comments there because, Joe Biden was talking about sort of big concepts, big challenges. Bernie's talking about winning. And I guess in this, let me go to you, Leah. I mean, in this, do you see Bernie Sanders as having a pathway to beating President Trump?
I think all of the, first of all, I'm not a big believer in national polls because I think it's generally the sample size is too small for it to be relevant.
Right.
So I just don't put much store in those. But if you look at those, any one of the candidates that's on the Democratic ballot beats Trump. I think that's a false. It is. That's what they say. Now there are different margins.
Right.
2%, 4%, whatever. But both Biden and Bernie beat Trump, and Warren and Pete and all of the rest, depending on the national poll.
Any of the above.
Any of the above. So I don't think, and I really, really take issue with this notion of somehow the establishment is conspiring to stop Bernie. People are trying to win an election. They're all trying to stop each other because that's the name of the game. Each one's trying to be the nominee. And so this is a contest. And Bernie's trying to stop Biden. Biden's trying to stop Bernie. Warren's trying to stop them both. That's what the election is about.
Michelle, you've got strong views on this. You don't think Biden can. I mean, I was raising the issue of polls here because Joe Biden is shown in many of the national polls to be someone who's very strong if pitted against Donald Trump. And many people believe that Donald Trump has been harassing and trolling the Democratic Party to bring on Bernie as a way, because he wants to run against Bernie. So tell me what I'm getting wrong.
Oh, the issue here is that you're going to have the same situation as in 2016, and that's what I'm afraid of. I mean, Einstein says the definition of insanity.
So define that situation for our watchers.
The exact same situation is having a candidate who is a moderate establishment candidate who is likable and has some good ideas, but does not actually excite anyone. And that's the problem, is you've got a chunk of voters, like you ladies have said, you've got a chunk of voters who you can count on to show up to the polls. But what about those who either don't affiliate with the Democratic Party or don't show up to vote unless they're excited? Bernie excites them, and he can count on the moderates. However, and if he can't count on the moderates, then we have a real problem here with the soul of the Democratic Party. But Biden doesn't excite these people, and that's really a danger. And I'm not just saying this as someone who does support Bernie Sanders. I'm saying this as someone who doesn't want to see 4 more years of Trump, or 8 or 12, Yeah.
And I think, though, that we have to look to the case studies that we have in front of us, right? In 2018, we saw a huge spike in turnout. We saw young people come to the polls in a way they never do in midterms. We saw a fantastic new class of House Democrats, that are new leaders of the party that all of us are really excited about, winning their elections, and on the backs of that turnout. That turnout was actually, if you break down kind of who actually delivered the victory to Democrats, the progressive data firm Catalyst says that 80% of that was voters who flipped from Trump. That was not new people that have sat on the sidelines. They were people who flipped and showed up. And a lot of those
who has the greater chance of flipping those candidates?
A lot of those were suburban women. And in the polling that I've seen of suburban women of all races, looking across the board, most Democrats are 10 points up on Trump among suburban women. And without suburban women, we cannot win this election. Bernie Sanders is tied. And that, I think, is very disconcerting. If he is turning off the suburban women that helped lead to the blue wave in 2018, then that's not a path forward.
Lene, when Americans get a chance to vote for president after the primaries are over, they are going to get a chance to vote perhaps for Bernie Sanders versus Trump, but there are a lot of other choices: senators, House members, governors, mayors. We call this the down ticket races. What does Bernie Sanders do? Does he elevate, and does he help those down ticket races, or does he hurt them?
My fear is that in the swing districts that we need to hold in order to hold the House, Bernie Sanders hurts those candidates. And I think you can see that by the fact that
What about Bernie Sanders makes it hard for them to jump on his bandwagon?
Well, I think he's taken some really unpopular policy positions. And then when you actually run the attacks that Trump is going to run, from the socialism attacks that these Senate and House races are already seeing, to the Medicare for All attacks, he's going to take away your insurance, those really damage his reputation.
But isn't Donald Trump also going to take away their insurance?
Yeah, well, he is. But you know what? That's actually why the Democratic Party has a 20-point advantage on health care right now.
Right.
And the only way we can lose that is by giving it away by running a candidate that's for Medicare for All. Because once you actually litigate the details of Medicare for All, the support that might be initially there in the polls completely evaporates. So once people know the details, they do not like that policy. And he has wedded himself to that policy and said it's his #1 thing that he'd do if he's in the White House. And that is really going to hurt those down ballot candidates. That's why not a single frontline candidate has endorsed Bernie Sanders.
Leah,
to your point, we've got to remember, the party has to remember that this is not just a race for the presidency. It's a race for the Senate and also the House. One of the worst outcomes would be that we win the presidency and lose everything else, or that we lose everything and we lose the House, the Senate, and you have a Donald Trump presidency with a Republican-controlled House and Senate. So I think we've got to be very big picture about this and figure out how we can sweep everything, and who is the candidate or candidates who can help us navigate that path so that
So you've run, as CEO, 2 conventions. You've been very close to these kinds of skirmishes before. And I just want to get you out of your comfort zone for a minute, Leah. And you know how 538 sometimes puts up a little, barometer on how. I want to ask you, if Bernie Sanders is the candidate, what are the chances you would put at the House and Senate, either one being lost?
Well, first I want to say that I haven't endorsed anyone, and I consider myself a
I'm
revolutionary member of the establishment. But I think it would be really tough in some of the swing districts, as she said, to hold on to those, because I think.
So you see a decline for the Democrats in the House?
In the House, and I don't think we would win the Senate. I just think I'm not convinced. I haven't seen the data.
All right, and let's put Elizabeth Warren in there, short form.
If she were the nominee.
I'm just being respectful since she's still in the race at this moment. What happens if Elizabeth Warren's a nominee?
I think you may still have a little bit of a danger point, but I don't know that it's as big a risk, I think, right now as a Sanders candidate.
And Joe Biden?
Even odds.
Even odds.
Even odds.
Even odds. So you're.
And I think maybe
Michelle,
51,
I'm going to give you a chance. But Michelle,
52%.
as you're talking to me about your own barometers, I want to raise this other guy who's out there. So Michelle, how do you see Mike Bloomberg? And I'll give you an opportunity to do the same thing, the barometer test, where you see the House and Senate if a Mike Bloomberg were to somehow come out on top of the ticket.
Yeah, I don't think Bloomberg excites anyone. And I think Bloomberg is a spoiler for Biden, even though I think it wasn't intended that way. It is very concerning to see the level of excitement around a Bloomberg candidacy, because all the way up and down, there's just, you need a candidate, and ideally you need a candidate and a vice presidential candidate who are both solidifying and bringing the entire party together, not just the party, but the nation. And Bloomberg doesn't do that. He really doesn't.
What do you think are the big roadblocks to Bernie Sanders winning it as you look at it right now? I know you're an advocate, but what do you think could get in the way of his win?
I think we have, and I'm really hopeful because I'm trying to restore trust from 2016. A lot of trust was broken across the field. But I think what I'm hoping for is that we have a transparent and fair process working our way towards the nomination. And I think that there's a possibility of that. I'm seeing
a lot. Is that possible, Leah?
Well, we have rules, and I think if we follow the
rules. Are
rules,
Russians playing by those rules?
Well, No, of course not. Of course not.
I mean, I raise it not facetiously because we saw Russian meddling in the last election.
And there have been
some have said, I mean, Bernie
that.
Sanders just won $45 million, didn't win, but earned, attracted $45 million in support this last quarter. And that is an enormous haul for him to take in a very short period of time.
Are you suggesting that's because of Russian?
Well, no, I'm not. I'm just saying that there are people out there that are beginning to talk about the ways that Russians, whether it's money, whether it's meddling in election results.
Me.
I'm sorry?
No, but it came from people like me, average day-to-day people who are donating 10, 15, 20 bucks a month.
Look, we can't. There have been the news reports of Russians meddling both in the Trump campaign and in the Sanders campaign. We don't really know because if we knew where it was coming from and how they were doing it, we would be able to stop it. So, but I think the key thing for us is, as we look toward convention, is all this talk about a contested convention and this burn the DNC and all this crazy talk out there about people who are going to shut the thing down. Is that the rules for the convention were established before there was anyone in the race, and Senator Sanders, before he was a candidate, helped to establish those rules and was the only candidate who was involved in the establishment of the rules. I'm on the Rules Committee, so I was intimately engaged in conversations with his campaign folks about what would work for them.
Including with superdelegates.
Including the superdelegates.
So let me just ask you, like in the last couple of minutes here.
Personal conversation with his team about that solution.
And he's changed his position because before he was in it, he had flip-flopped in it. When he ran 4 years ago, he was in a very different spot.
Yeah.
So my question to you in the last couple of minutes we have, and Lenny, I'm going to start with you, is just how deep is the mistrust, the uncertainty in the party that if Bernie Sanders was to win, would you be able to support that candidate? Do you see structurally a problem for enthusiasm of coming out? And I would say vice versa. I mean, how do you think that problem gets solved? How big is the divide? How big is the mother of all wars within the Democratic Party?
I think all of us are really hyper-focused on the task before us, which is beating Donald Trump. And it will be incumbent on whoever is our nominee to reach out to all parts of the party and make sure that everyone knows that they are welcome in that big tent of a party. The thing about the Democratic Party is we are a lot more diverse in every possible way than the Republican Party. And that, I think, is a source of our strength. And, when you have 80% of Republicans being self-described conservatives and almost all of them being white men, at least in elected office at this point, it's a lot easier to get unanimity. It's harder to get unanimity in our party, and I think it makes us better at representing the entire country. And so my hope is that we can all come together around whoever can win the majority of delegates, because that's the rule, and that means that you've gotten a broad base within the party to say this is our person.
Leah, same question.
I think that we do want to win. We're focused on winning. I think that the rules are in place to ensure that every part of the party feels heard and feels that the process is fair. And so, as my mother said, rules are made for the unruly. So, we're going to come to convention. There'll be some unruliness because we're Democrats and we like it that way. But
if Bernie Sanders wins, you're not worried about some people saying, I'm going to take my toys and go home?
I think if whoever the nominee is, I think the bulk of the party, if it's Bernie, will support them. I worry, quite frankly, on the Biden side, if the nominee is Biden, that there will be some discontented folks from the other wings of the party, the independent part, the Sanders part, who feel that the process was somehow rigged. Nobody's ever been able to explain to me what that means.
Oh, we can talk later.
Right. Michelle, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah.
Will your Bernie bro pals and your Bernie other fans, will they support a Joe Biden candidacy if he comes out on top?
So first of all, the term Bernie bro, it completely negates a huge percentage of Bernie supporters like myself, who are women or who are minorities who are from across the entire spectrum. And so I just want to state that.
Yeah, that's good.
I do think that regardless, as long as the process is transparent, whoever becomes the nominee, transparent like our lives do depend on it. If that happens, then yes, we will be able to get unity. Because like we saw in 2016, Bernie did go out there and he did walk around and he did talk about Hillary and tried to get her elected. And I think the issue
a lot of Hillary people don't think he did enough.
Well, they need to look at the numbers and they need to hear how annoyed we were when he was doing it sometimes. But the point is that a lot of us, most of us, I would say, the vast majority of us went out and supported Hillary in 2016. The point is that the Democratic Party in 2016 didn't understand that a huge percentage of Bernie supporters were never Democrats, and they weren't going to be after the primary unless he became the nominee. So that's what we're looking at here. We have to make sure that we have a transparent process, and God willing, everything will go well.
But that's why we have rules to ensure transparency.
Well, Super Tuesday is here, and this has been such a thoughtful conversation. I'm very grateful. I'd like to thank you all for being with us. Reverend Leah Daughtry, former CEO of the Democratic National Convention, Michelle Gale, Democratic Party activist in Chicago, and Lene Erickson, a Democratic strategist here in Washington, D.C. So what's the bottom line? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, some know her as AOC, is right. In any other nation, she and Joe Biden would be in totally different parties. And Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden would be in different parties, too. There are huge differences of perspective between these two candidates on how radical to be on environmental policy or on immigration, on education, health care. This is a rough tug of war between different camps, all driven by different passions and grievances inside the same party in America. What is clear is that when a Democratic candidate is named, whether it's Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, what's going to unify them will not be what it is for, but rather what it is against. And that unifying call will be moving President Donald J. Trump out of the White House. And that's the bottom line.